How dare you turn my mourning into paperwork?
You don't deserve a say. Sign it and let someone competent take control.
The will says otherwise, and nothing moves under the court's order.
Candles seemed to blink, and the room fell into that careful quiet where every breath counts. The envelope on the linen stopped being paper and started looking like a lever that would not move. Evelyn kept her keys in her palm and her voice even. Jason's certainty thinned, and Lauren's silence began to crack into questions. From this hush, the path opens law against pressure, dignity against convenience, a family deciding which truth it can live with. Do you agree with how Evelyn acted? Share below and follow for more. Rain thinned to a mist over the shingles of the Craftsman house in Ballard, the kind of soft Seattle weather that makes sidewalks gleam and old cedar smell like a memory. Evelyn Hart stood at the base of her porch steps and steadied herself with a rail. The black coat she had worn to the memorial still held the faint trace of church incense, and when she looked up, she saw her daughter Lauren and her son-in-law Jason waiting beneath the eaves with a thick envelope between them. Lauren's eyes were rimmed with the sleepless pink that follows a week of arrangements and casseroles. Jason wore his careful smile, the one that showed just enough concern to look polite and just enough impatience to suggest there were practical matters to settle. Evelyn reached the landing and unlocked the door. The key turned easily. It was, after all, her house. The foyer felt different in the hush that comes after visitors go home. The clock on the wall ticked as it always had, an ordinary comfort that made her shoulders drop a fraction. She slid off her coat, set it on the banister, and turned to face them. The envelope rustled as Jason lifted it. "We brought a copy," he said. He did not say of what. He did not need to. Papers had hovered like a cloud over every conversation since the morning they chose hymns as street marks. Lauren touched her mother's arm the way a person does when they want to be gentle and also move you along. "It's just to keep things simple," she added, and her voice rounded the word simple until it sounded like a promise. Evelyn led them to the dining table. The winter light diluted across the wood and made a pale rectangle around the envelope when Jason set it down. He spoke with the pleasant rhythm of a person who believes he is translating a complicated world into easy steps. He talked about transition, about temporary measures, about how families often do better when one person handles the details until things are sorted. He said the word temporary more than once. He spoke of responsibility, of protecting assets, of making sure nothing fell through the cracks. He also said Evelyn was a lot on her plate right now, and that signing a short document could spare her from, as he put it, unnecessary strain. She listened. She looked at her daughter, whose mouth trembled at the corners before she pressed it flat. She looked at the envelope, which had a crease where a thumb had worried it. She thought of the smell of potlucks in the church hall, and of the steady line of people who had come to say how much they had admired her husband's steadiness, his quiet way of paying attention. Grief is a long hallway with doors on both sides. Every noise sounds like it might be someone you lost. She drew a breath and said she would not sign anything she had not read at the table where a lawyer sat with her, and she said it without heat. The words felt cool in her mouth, clean. Jason's smile did not vanish so much as relocate to the careful fold at the edge of his lips. "Of course," he said, "we can make an appointment. For now, let me keep one set of keys, just to make sure deliveries and maintenance are handled." He held out his hand as if asking for a pencil. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the steel ring. She felt the familiar weight of the house in that small circle, the back door that stuck when it rained, the upstairs window that sang in the breeze, the pantry shelf where she kept the jar of wildflower honey because he had liked it in his tea. She did not raise her voice. She said the mail came through the slot and the maintenance man had her number and there were no deliveries expected. She said she would consider the question of keys after she spoke to counsel. Lauren's hand floated toward the keys, then fell back to her side like a leaf that forgets the wind for a heartbeat. "Mom," she said, and the word mom was a plea and an apology and a habit all at once. They left without the paper signed. On the porch, Jason adjusted his scarf and told Lauren he would call someone. She did not ask who. Evelyn stood in the doorway until the street swallowed the red blink of their taillights, and the rain curved back into a steady whisper. Inside, she placed the envelope on the sideboard and did not open it. She went upstairs to the quiet bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, her palms on the coverlet, her eyes on the window. The night pressed gently on the glass. Grief rearranges a house. It moves the center of gravity. It changes what doors people knock on. She looked down at her hands and saw the small tremor she had kept out of her voice, and she let it pass through and away like a tide that recedes because it was always meant to. She rose and crossed to the dresser. In the top drawer lay the box that held 2 rings, a silver band and a worn gold circle that had taken the shape of a lifetime. She opened the lid and rested her fingertips on the cool metal the way one might greet someone at the end of a long day. Beside the box, a folded note in her husband's square handwriting carried a sentence he had spoken often when bills piled up, or a form arrived with a blank line that made no sense. Do not sign what you do not understand. She placed the note under the bed, as if tucking in a child for the night. She returned to the hall and paused by the clock. The tick held the room as sure as any hand could. In the kitchen, she made tea. The kettle sang softly. The steam smelled like lemons. She leaned on the counter and thought about the small choices people make when they are tired. The way a simple yes can be an exit that turns into a maze. Families have their own arithmetic. Love is not a ledger, and yet people keep score. She sipped and looked at the envelope on the sideboard. She remembered the first time they had brought Lauren home to this house, how the nurse had said a body remembers safety in its bones. The tea cooled, the rain settled, the night became a soft coat draped across the shoulders of the street. Sleep came late and light. Dawn was the color of pewter. Evelyn, dressed in her warmest sweater and a practical coat, slipped the envelope into her tote and walked to the bus stop at the corner. The air smelled like wet pine. A neighbor waved from a porch across the street, the quick, kind greeting of people who share a block more than a biography. On the bus, she watched the city shrug into mourning. Couples under shared umbrellas, a dog wearing a small jacket, a delivery driver lifting a stack of boxes like a rhythm. She rode toward Capitol Hill, where a cab kept a chalkboard sign that promised warm things in cold weather. The bell over the cab door chimed, and heat moved over her face like a hand from an old friend. The place had the comfortable hum of a room where the barista knows regulars buy their drinks and people leave $1 or $2 in the tip jar without ceremony. A woman in a navy apron greeted her with the bright courtesy Seattle uses to light gray days. Evelyn ordered coffee and a slice of toast. When the mug arrived, the barista tipped the pot toward the table and said she would be back around for refills. The first sip was honest and uncomplicated. At the table by the window, she watched the street ripen into motion. A man in a green ring shell held the door for a stranger. The world was a little kinder than the news suggested, at least in rooms where steam curled from mugs. She set the envelope on the table and slid a fingernail under the flap, then stopped. The pause was not fear. It was respect. She had told them she would not read unless a lawyer sat next to her. And one of the few ways a person maintains dignity when they are tired is by doing the thing they said they would do. She closed the flap and reached for a paper napkin. With a pen she uncapped like a small promise, she wrote Daniel Whitman, and then a phone number a friend at church had passed along at the memorial. When casseroles lined the table like a parade of good intentions, she wrote slowly, as if each number were a small stone placed in the path. The barista swung by with the pot and lifted it in a question. Evelyn nodded. The dark ribbon of coffee rose to the rim a second time. She tucked a folded bill under the saucer the way her mother had taught her. A gesture not only of payment but of recognition. Someone had carried warmth to her table when the day still had its coat on. Outside, a man shook raindrops from an umbrella with a practiced snap. The light on the counter clipped off and on as a staff member checked the decorations that would later glow comfort into early sunset. On the corkboard by the door, a flyer announced a choir concert at Street Marks, and for a moment, Evelyn could hear voices layering over stone the way rain layered over the city. She thought of Lauren's face on the porch, and of the way guilt and pride lived next door. She thought of Jason's hands hovering above the keys, of how quickly an offer to help can become a lever. She was not interested in a fight. She was interested in clarity. She wanted to keep the house her husband had tended while he lived, and the ordinary dignity of deciding when to change a light bulb and when to call someone. She wanted a holiday season that did not require her to guard a spoon drawer. She wanted to treat her daughter like a woman, not a child, and to be treated like a woman herself, not a signature on a line someone else had drawn. The coffee cooled again. She placed her palm on the envelope for a moment and then took her hand away. The door opened and closed. A small boy in a yellow raincoat laughed at his own boots. A woman at the counter asked for directions to a bus line, and the barista drew a map on the back of a receipt with cheerful care. The city had a way of reminding you that most lives were made of tasks finished and kindness offered, that even on the morning when you were thinking about documents people pressed on you, there were also cinnamon rolls and shared tables. She checked the time by the position of the light on the floor and thought of church friends who had told her to call if she needed anything at all. She had never been skilled at asking. It felt, to her, like passing a burden hand to hand across a room toward a person who already had arms full. But certain calls are not burdens. They are bridges. You walk across them to someplace firmer. The bell chimed again and she looked up, half expecting someone she knew by the tilt of a winter hat. No one she recognized came in. She returned her gaze to the napkin where she had written the lawyer's name and number in block letters even a tired eye could read. She set the pen down, took a breath, and reached for her phone. She dialed Daniel. On the other end, a calm voice. "Can you come to the office this afternoon?" The elevator opened to a view of glass and rain, the kind of downtown morning when a city wears a gray coat and the streets shine like slate. Daniel Whitman's office kept its own weather. Quiet, steady, a room that preferred facts to drama. Evelyn sat across from him with her toad on her lap, the unopened envelope inside, like a small, sleeping animal. Daniel listened as she described the porch, the envelope, the request for keys, and then he asked gentle, narrow questions that placed each detail where it belonged. He did not hurry her. When she finished, he folded his hands and said they would move step by step, that in this county, matters of inheritance went through a specific court, and that protection existed for people who needed time to breathe before signing anything. He phoned 2 colleagues. A woman named Renee Alvarez, sharp-eyed and calm, would trace the paper trail around the supposed document, and the appointments that did or did not exist. A man named Oliver Kim, patient as rain, would compare signatures and dates, and check the path of money that had been painted as complicated when it might simply be precise. Daniel made a list that read like a plan you could hold. By late morning, the courthouse corridor held a soft echo of shoes and the dry murmur of office voices. Evelyn walked beside Daniel, reading plaques the way people read the names of saints. He guided her to the clerk, filed a motion for a temporary order to preserve the estate, and explained in low tones how the court weighed urgency and fairness, how it looked first to prevent harm. They waited on the wooden bench that had seen every sort of conversation, from relief to grief. Daniel spoke about ordinary things, the way the courthouse calf used too much ice, the ferry schedule on Puget Sound, the choir at street marks when the holidays drew near. He kept sadness out of the conversation without pretending it did not exist. When the clerk returned, the file had a ribbon of movement through it. Paper can feel like help when you have language to hold it. They left the courthouse for a midday meeting at a bank on 2nd Avenue. The lobby smelled faintly of eucalyptus and printer ink. A manager named Thomas Greer greeted them with the careful courtesy of someone who knows the right word can be a bridge. He offered water. He kept his phrasing neutral. He said the bank would do exactly as the court directed once it received the proper order, and that until then the institution could not act. He added, in a tone meant to sound like a footnote, that the branch had fielded a few calls suggesting concerns about Evelyn's stability, and he wanted them to know those calls did not alter the bank's standards. Evelyn thanked him for saying it aloud. Daniel nodded, left his card, and said they would be back with the paperwork. Thomas shook their hands and watched them go the way a person watches the weather before it changes. Outside, the rain paused long enough for light to find the metal of a bus stop sign and turn it into a small star. Evelyn and Daniel took a short walk to shake off the lobby's stillness. They ended up in the covered lanes of Pike Place Market, where the air held flowers and fish and cinnamon at the same time. A vendor called out a greeting. A woman arranged dahlias with the attention of a surgeon. A young couple argued amiably about which jam to buy for a relative who did not eat sugar. Evelyn bought a bouquet of something bright and winter-hardy and pinned a small card to it for the church board that had sent so many casseroles. On the public notice board, a neighborhood blog post about family disputes over estates had gathered brisk comments, some kind, some not. It was a reminder that stories travel without their owners, and that once loose, they prefer speed to accuracy. Daniel glanced at the page and said, a reporter he trusted sometimes wrote about elder dignity and might be useful later, but not today. Today belonged to the next step. Afternoon carried them back through the courthouse doors. The same bench, the same hum, a different file. Paperwork moved from intention to consideration. A judge reviewed the motion and asked for a few clarifications, and Daniel answered in the tone he used for facts that did not need polish. He described Evelyn's wish to preserve her home and time to understand the claims placed in front of her. He did not name a villain, he did not need to. The law recognizes pressure when it sees its shape. Evelyn sat very still and breathed as if steadiness itself were a way to honor what the moment required. When the decision arrived, it arrived in the language of restraint. A temporary order to protect the estate from changes until the court could hear more. Daniel thanked the clerk. Evelyn nodded once, as if something inside her had chosen a chair and sat down. They walked again, not far, just enough to let relief find the muscles that had been holding a quiet storm. In the lobby, Daniel checked his messages. Renee had already confirmed inconsistencies in the scheduling around the supposed notarization. Oliver reported that preliminary comparisons of signature rhythm raised questions that, stated plainly, did not look good for the document's validity. The plan was unfolding with the measured certainty of a train taking the right track after a long switch. Daniel proposed one more stop. A return to the bank to place the order in the right hands before the end of business, so that the night would belong to rest rather than worry. Back at the bank, Thomas received the certified copy of the order as if it were a key with an address on it. He explained, carefully and without drama, how the bank would now secure the accounts against changes, how notifications would be sent, how notes would be added so branches could read the same story. He did not speak down to Evelyn. He spoke to her. She thanked him, then thanked the teller who had pointed them to the manager, then thanked Daniel for being the sort of person who could move paper without turning people into paper. Outside, the late afternoon had that Seattle gray that keeps your collar up but still lets you see your breath as a thin ribbon when you laugh at a joke that is not quite funny but kind. They parted in front of the light rail entrance. Daniel promised updates as soon as Renee and Oliver delivered theirs, and he told Evelyn to call if anyone asked her to sign anything or hand over keys. He suggested soup from a diner he liked in Capitol Hill and a quiet evening. She promised to try the soup. On the train, she watched families negotiate seats, a toddler negotiate a mitten, a teenager negotiate a playlist his grandmother pretended to ignore. Ordinary life kept its beat. At home, she placed the flowers in a heavy glass jar and set them where the light could find them. She called a church friend to say thank you for the lawyer's number, and the friend said the choir was rehearsing for a concert soon and that if Evelyn felt up to it, there would be cocoa afterward. Twilight settled with the patience of a cat. Evelyn made tea and buttered a piece of toast, because comfort sometimes lives in small kitchens. She looked again at the envelope and felt no need to open it. She had promised herself she would not read it without counsel, and promises kept are the scaffolding of a weary day. Her phone buzzed. First came a notice from Daniel. The order had been transmitted to the necessary parties. He would check again in the morning. Then came a small storm of messages she chose not to answer. A cousin asking vague questions. An acquaintance forwarding a rumor from a neighborhood page. A number she did not recognize instructing her to be reasonable. Noise is not the same as music, she reminded herself, and she set the phone face down until the kettle sang. When she picked it up again, the screen showed a name she knew all too well. Evelyn received another message from Judith Pierce. Come talk properly. We are family. The 3 dots on Lauren's chat still blinked. A half promise. The house in Magnolia glowed with the kind of warmth that comes from ovens and effort. Porch lights pulled on wet steps, and coats gathered on the rack by the door like old friends who did not quite know where to hang their arms. Inside, the dining room opened wide, all amber lamps, and the long table dressed in autumn cloth. The turkey waited under a silver dome. Pies cooled on the sideboard. People stood in small islands of talk, exchanging the careful laughter families learn when a hard subject circles the room but has not yet decided where to land. Evelyn stepped in with Daniel a half pace behind, their breath still tasting of rain. The last days had been a climb through offices and corridors, through a courthouse bench that steadied her, and a bank lobby that did not. And now this. A room that smelled like cinnamon and butter, and the long habit of holidays. She met the eyes that turned toward her and found welcome there, yes, but also the thin glaze of expectation. A cousin hugged her and patted her back in a rhythm that said, both we're glad you are here and please let everything be easy. Judith Pierce arrived with a brisk kiss near the cheek and the kind of smile that looks like a plan. Jason moved through the throng with his careful politeness, and Lauren carried plates, busy with tasks that gave her hands an honest reason not to shake. Daniel offered his coat to the rack and placed a folder beneath his arm, a quiet anchor. In the kitchen, he had already walked Evelyn through what they carried and why. The temporary order from the court sat at the front, a restraint written in the language of protection rather than accusation. Behind it lived a preliminary analysis from Oliver about signatures that did not sit right on the page, and a summary from Renee about appointments that had happened on paper but not in the world. In a separate envelope lay a letter to be presented only when needed, the limited confirmation that certain money was not the shadow people had whispered it was. He had reminded her that patience was part of strength, that a room like this was not a courtroom, and that they could still be kind while also being clear. She had nodded. Grief had taught her how to hold two truths at once. They were ushered into their seats with the soft authority of the relative who owned the table. Bowed heads found a moment of silence that made its way around like a candle passed row to row. When place began to fill and conversation loosened, the talk stayed polite, as if interest and mercy had agreed to keep a space between them. A nephew asked about the choir at St. Mark's, and Evelyn said the voices were practicing pieces that sounded like the first light of the shortest days. A niece complimented the cranberry relish and confessed to using a recipe passed down without the measurements, the way families pass down songs and legends. Someone offered to refill water, someone else reached for the salt. Through it all, Evelyn could feel the envelope Jason had not yet placed on the table, like a storm cloud that has not decided when to let go. Jason waited until plates were 3/4 empty. He touched the envelope with 2 fingers and stood as if he were about to propose a toast. Instead, he spoke about how families do better when they avoid drama, how the holidays can be a tender time for people who have lost someone, how it is wise to keep the practical from becoming emotional. He used the word temporary and the word transition and the phrase for the sake of everybody. He said there was a single document that could spare a lot of trouble, a simple agreement to allow him to manage certain matters until everything settled. He looked around the table for assent and found it in a few nods, mostly from people who believed life is easiest when someone says they will handle it. Judith's voice drifted in like a ribbon. If we do this quietly, we will all keep our dignity. Lauren lifted her glass, but her hand did not remember how to be steady. Daniel did not interrupt. He allowed the quiet to do some of the work a lawyer cannot. When he finally spoke, it was in the tone of a man explaining how to read a weather map. He reminded the room that the court had already issued a temporary order to preserve the estate, while facts were gathered and kindness could catch up to loss. He said the order was not an accusation, but a pause. He did not say that a pause can be the difference between pressure and choice, because the room already knew, even if it did not know, it knew. A cousin asked if lawyers were necessary between people who loved each other. Daniel said, law is not a barrier to love, but a fence that keeps out the goats that will eat it. Someone laughed, relieved to have a line to repeat later in the kitchen. Jason slid the envelope toward Evelyn. He framed it as a way to keep the calendar from filling with errands she did not want. He mentioned maintenance and deliveries and the sort of chores that turn a day into a list. He added that the bank required one person to be the point of contact and that he had the availability and the temperament for it. He did not mention his calls to the bank. He did not mention the story that had begun to sprout on a neighborhood blog. He did not mention that sometimes a lever looks like a helping hand until it lifts where you live. Evelyn kept her hands flat on the table. She let him finish. Kindness takes no strength at all when nothing is at stake. Real gentleness is measured when it sits beside a request. She asked one question. Would the agreement he proposed respect the order already in place? Jason hesitated and said the agreement would be compatible with it, that it was only to make things smoother. Daniel leaned in without leaning forward. He asked if he might see the paper. Jason produced it and placed it on the linen as if it were a guest. The sheet bore a serious font and the language of efficiency. It was titled in a way that suggested permission granted without cost. Daniel read silently, his eyes moving with the measured care of a man reading a map in fog. He asked for the page that showed who had notarized the signature if the intent was to execute it tonight. Jason handed over the second sheet. It was in that moment that the room, still and warm and smelling of sage, changed. Daniel tilted the paper to the light. He did not accuse. He observed. There, in a corner where the page expected a stamp, something looked too perfect. A notary seal that wore its letters like a decal rather than an impression. The circle sat on the fibers without sinking in, the way a sticker glosses the surface of a notebook instead of becoming a part of it. He touched it with the pad of his finger, then set the page down as if it were a glass that might crack. In a gentle voice, he asked who had prepared the document. Jason said a professional had done it. Daniel asked where. Jason named the city office in terms so vague they slid off the ear. Daniel explained, for the benefit of the room, how notarization worked, how an imprint could be felt as much as seen, how dates and logs and human eyes make a thing real. He did not need to say what the room was already tasting, a flavor of wrong in something dressed up to look right. Judith cleared her throat and urged everyone to remember the spirit of the day. A relative in the far chair said maybe the details did not matter as much as moving forward, that sometimes the right thing wears odd clothes. Daniel smiled politely and said the right thing does not mind being looked at closely. He kept his tone soft. He placed the court order gently on top of the agreement and said the law had asked everyone to wait, and that waiting in this case was not a weakness but a respect. Evelyn looked at Lauren then, and in her daughter's face she saw a flicker that was not defiance but fatigue with the theater of it all. The flicker looked like a person remembering what her own name felt like when spoken without pressure. Conversation thinned. Forks found place the way hands find pockets when they do not know where else to go. The turkey cooled a degree. Someone in the kitchen checked the rolls. Jason sat but kept one hand on the envelope as if it were a leash. He said the notary could be found. He said the paper could be redone. He said the intent mattered more than the ink. Daniel said ink is how you make intent keep its promises. No one raised a voice. The tension came from the careful refusal to be unkind when unkindness would have been faster. Lauren asked for a dish to be passed and then forgot to take anything from it. Her eyes looked not at the page but at her mother's hands, as if trying to remember a time when those hands had braided her hair, while the news on the radio filled the kitchen with ordinary stories about weather and school levies and ferry delays. Evelyn felt a clarity rise in her, like a tide that has been waiting on the moon. She reached for her tote and placed it on the chair beside her. She did not hurry. The room could feel her gathering, as if a window were being opened 1 inch at a time. She thought of the choir flyer on the Cough Court board, of Thomas at the bank speaking to her like a person rather than a problem, of the clerk at the courthouse, who placed the file into the right basket with hands that understood what it meant to hold a stranger's day for a moment. She thought of how grief can make a person either smaller or more exact, and how she would choose exact. Jason's voice tried one more path. He said to think of it as practical, to be reasonable, to remember that families have to trust someone. He did not notice that his words had started to repeat like steps on a small circle. Judith invoked dignity again. A distant uncle asked if they could take the conversation into the living room after dessert. Daniel folded the document and slid it back across the table with the care one uses when returning a fragile thing to its owner. He did not say the word invalid. He did not need to. The word sat, unspeaking, in the space between the stamp and the page. Rain ticked at the window the way a clock does when a room needs a beat. The scent of pumpkin pie lifted and found its way into the moment, like a kind gesture sent from another part of the house. Someone refilled water. Someone stacked used plates at the edge of the table because doing helps when thinking does not. Evelyn's gaze moved around the faces she had known since Lauren wore a backpack with cartoon dogs. Love was here, braided in between the habits and the hurts. Love does not mean you hand over your keys. Love means you hold to what is right. So the house still stands next year when the same people come back with new stories. She reached into her tote and removed a slim, organized folder. The motion was quiet but decisive. A hand placing a compass on a table when everyone has been walking in circles. She rested the folder on the linen, centered it in front of her as if setting a place for a guest who had arrived precisely on time. Her voice was steady. Evelyn placed her folder on the table and said, "Before anyone signs anything, please look at these documents." The door to the climax opened. The dining room in Magnolia held its breath the way a friendly room does. When it senses the conversation is about to move from weather to weathering. Candles stood at polite attention. Plates hovered between bites and pauses. The silver dome still covered the turkey as if to remind everyone that, for a moment longer, ritual could pretend to be refuge. Evelyn slid the slim folder onto the linen, and with a nod to Daniel, opened it so people could see paper rather than rumor. At the top lay the temporary order from the court, a sentence of protection written without blame, the judicial way of saying, "Let us keep things still until we know what they are." Beneath it were clean copies of pages that had spent the last day moving through careful hands. Oliver's preliminary notes about signatures that did not behave like signatures made by a living hand at a living desk, and Renee's chronology placing clock time and calendar time against appointment logs that did not agree with themselves. In a separate sleeve rested the letter that waited for the right breath to arrive, the limited confirmation that spoke only to what the law permitted it to speak, that certain funds were not in themselves under any cloud known to the issuing office. Daniel kept his voice low and even, the tone of a person who trusts a room to hear if given a bridge and not a cliff. He said the order was not a hammer, it was a pause. He said the notes were not a verdict, they were questions dressed in ink. He invited eyes to read before mouths decided. Jason tried to place his own paper on top of the pile with a flourish meant to feel like leadership. He spoke about keeping things smooth, about not letting logistics colonize grief, about how one person with a calm temperament should steer the practical until the horizon steadied. He stood a little straighter when a few heads nodded. He softened his consonants when he said temporary, as if padding the word would change its meaning. Judith, regal with concern, murmured that the quiet solution is always a dignified one, and that dignity was what everyone here deserved. Daniel asked, as if in passing, where the notarization for Jason's agreement had taken place. Jason answered in glossy terms. A downtown office? A recommendation through a professional acquaintance? All very standard. Daniel angled the page toward the lamp and ran a fingertip along the seal that sat too perfectly on the fibers, like a decal pretending to be a press. He did not accuse, he described what a true emboss would feel like, how a stamp leaves a small landscape on the page, a geography you can sense with skin and not just sight. A murmur passed through the chairs that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, the sound people make when their minds quietly align with something their eyes have already decided. A cousin asked if, perhaps, the exact stamp mattered less than the good intent that brought it into the room. Daniel smiled the way a teacher smiles when a student offers a generous wrong answer. He said, "Good intent is the wind. A valid document is a sail. Without the sail, the boat goes nowhere you mean it to go." He lifted the court order with 2 fingers as if to show it weighed less emotionally than people imagined. He explained that the order asked everyone to let the estate rest untouched while facts were gathered and feelings could breathe, that the bank would follow precisely what the court had written, and that this was how the world kept fairness available even to those who arrived tired. Judith suggested moving the conversation to the living room after dessert. Daniel said dessert tasted better when no one was being asked to sign between bites. The doorbell rang. It was not a loud sound, but it traveled as far as it needed to. Daniel glanced at Evelyn, who gave the smallest nod, and then he rose to answer. At the threshold stood a woman in a dark coat with a badge carried in a way that did not feel like a fist. She introduced herself as Dana Morales and greeted the host by name. Her presence altered the air not by weight but by alignment. as if the furniture had shifted a few inches closer to square. In the dining room, she did not sit. She did not comment on anything beyond the reason she had come. In measured language, with no more and no less than the law allowed, she provided a limited confirmation letter addressed to Evelyn's counsel, stating that the specific categories of funds referenced in prior correspondence were, as of that date, not under any known legal impediment as defined by the office issuing the letter. She declined to answer questions beyond the letter's scope, and when thanked, she said only that clarity serves everyone. Her code carried a few silver drops from the magnolia rain. They glittered and then were just water. For a heartbeat, the room found silence as clean as church stone. Two relatives looked down at their napkins with sudden interest, as if linen could help them remember what side of the table they preferred. Lauren's face shifted in ways small and human, guilt brushing against relief, pride trying to remember it had other names. Jason's jaw worked as though it had been handed a sentence with too many commas. He placed his palm on his envelope and did not lift it. Daniel slid the limited confirmation into the sleeve where it belonged without fanfare, the way a person files a birth certificate, carefully aware that paper both is and is not the thing it represents. A phone vibrated. Daniel checked the screen and asked the room's permission to take a call related to the order already on the table. Permission was granted with a dozen nods and a half-dozen looks that emitted curiosity. He stepped a pace away, turned the volume to a level that respected the room, and spoke. The voice on the other end identified himself as Thomas Greer, the bank manager, calling to confirm receipt of the certified order and to advise, in plain terms, that the estate accounts were now secured against changes per the court's direction, that internal notes had been placed, and that notifications were being sent, so all relevant branches would see a single story when they opened their systems. Daniel thanked him and asked if Thomas would like to repeat the key points for Evelyn's benefit. Thomas did so without drama and without detail beyond process. The call ended with politeness that sounded like relief dressed in protocol. Someone reached for a pitcher of water and poured with the exaggerated care of a person conscious of being washed. The pies continued to perfume the air with cinnamon and nutmeg, a domestic insistence that life keeps offering sweetness even when the script reads sour. Jason reclaimed his chair but kept his hand near the envelope as if proximity might substitute for authority. He began again with words that had worked on other days. Practical, reasonable, for everyone's sake. But the room did not lean toward him in the same way now, and his sentences seemed to loop back to their own beginnings. Daniel did not pursue him. He let the paper say what paper says when it is honest. Renee's printed timeline lay where anyone could see how an appointment on a certain day could not have occurred in the hour someone claimed, because the person meant to officiate had been in a different neighborhood at a different desk, a fact established by a public record no one here had thought to argue with. The tension did not break. It softened into shape, like dough that has finally accepted the bowl it is in. A relative at the far end asked whether anyone wanted coffee. Judith suggested that civility was the real goal, and that civility sometimes requires looking past trifles. Evelyn, who had said little since opening the folder, raised her head and met Judith's eyes with a steadiness that did not accuse and did not yield. She said, "Civility is not the same as silence." She said she would not be signing anything tonight. She said she wanted to keep her home, to honor her husband's clear wish that she understand what she was being asked to sign before she signed it, and to let the season be about gratitude rather than transactions. The sentence had no barbs. It did not need them. It simply took its place at the table and asked others to do likewise. Daniel turned one last page. He did not do it with flourish. He laid a short series of printed messages beside the other documents. Messages that traced a line from Jason to a public relations acquaintance about positioning a story, about nudging a neighborhood blog toward a particular narrative, about encouraging a few calls to a bank so a manager would feel there was a question in the air. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be. They were simple and unmistakable, like footprints in fresh snow. Jason reached for the papers, then let his hand fall back. Lauren's breath caught, and in that small sound lived the fatigue of being asked to carry a plan she had not drawn. Someone at the end of the table shifted in a chair that creaked, like an honest confession. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. The balance in the room had already moved its way to a different foot. Evelyn's calm was not a performance. It was what happens when a person who has been pushed to the edge of a page writes a margin and calls it a boundary. She thanked the host for the meal. She thanked Daniel for bringing clarity in a way that did not bruise. She looked at her daughter, and this time she did not try to rescue Lauren from her own choices. She offered, instead, the dignity of treating her like a grown woman, capable of making a different one. There was kindness in that, and a little ache. People began to accept that the evening would not deliver the simple signature some of them had been promised. Plates were cleared in a gentle clatter that sounded like closure. The turkey finally lost its silver hat. Coffee arrived in thick white mugs, and sugar bowls slid across the cloth with the easy scrape of porcelain. The rain at the window remembered its steady rhythm and returned to it. A few relatives made small talk about ferries and forecasts and choir programs, the conversational equivalent of folding napkins into tidy squares. Daniel closed the folder without drama. Evelyn turned to her daughter, and the room tilted a fraction toward them, the way rooms do when they understand that something true is about to be said without the protection of podiums or paperwork. She spoke quietly, so the sentence belonged to the person who most needed to hear it. Evelyn looked at Lauren and said, "Can you come meet me at the Capitol on Capitol Hill tomorrow?" Lauren nodded, her eyes rimmed red. Jason clenched the envelope, silent. The windows of the Capitol Hill cafes held a light fog that came and went with each draft from the door, and the room answered with the soft sounds of cups finding saucers and milk steaming to a careful hush. Evelyn and Lauren sat at a small table near the front, close enough to the window to feel the weather as a presence rather than a problem. The barista set down 2 mugs and said he would swing back for refills. He meant it. People in this place refilled because that was part of the warmth they served. A tip jar with a few folded bills sat beside the register like a small vote for decency. The world outside moved in its greatcoat. Inside, the light ran along the lip of each cup as if measuring what patience looked like in the room. They had met here because both knew kitchens could swallow conversation with chores and because neutral ground lets hard words breathe. The night at Magnolia had taken a slow kind of courage. This morning asked for a different kind, quieter but no smaller. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her mug and watched the steam carry the lemon scent that always made her think of first days and clean tables. She thought of her daughter as a woman, not a child, a person with a life she did not supervise, whose choices had begun to move through other rooms and knock on other doors. Lauren, eyes still red around the rim from a short night, traced the edge of a napkin until a square felt like a harbor. She began and stopped and then began again. She said she had let herself be pulled into a plan that did not feel like her, that she was ashamed of the way she had leaned on the idea of keeping the peace when what she meant was keeping faith. She said she had been afraid of conflict and had ended up building a larger one. Evelyn did not hurry her. She said the simplest truths she knew, that love required clarity, that respect did not ask a person to sign against herself, that dignity was not a luxury of youth, but the backbone of any life worth walking through. She added that the court had put a pause on the estate so people could think before they acted, and that she expected Lauren to help keep that pause clean. When the barista passed with the pot, they lifted their mugs without breaking the thread. Evelyn tipped with the old habit her mother had taught her, the way you tip not only for the coffee, but for the small kindness of being seen as more than a transaction. She set a napkin on the table and wrote with a deliberate hand the 2 conditions that would keep the bridge between them standing. A public apology that named what had happened without excuses, and hours of community service handed to the elder support fund she meant to start at St. Mark's. She said there was a 3rd expectation that did not need ink. Lauren would cooperate with the court fully and would not play games with paperwork. Lauren listened with the attention of a person who had grown tired of arguing with herself. She nodded, slowly at first, and then with something like relief, as if a mask she did not know she was wearing had become too heavy to hold in place. She said she would do those things. She asked if it would change anything between them beyond the surface. Evelyn looked at her daughter and said that apologies are not magic, but they make space for work to begin. She said boundaries are how love lives in the house without breaking the furniture. Outside, A city bus sighed to a stop. People climbed in, each carrying a small weather of their own. The phone on the table vibrated with a call from Daniel. He spoke with the steady cadence of a man who had spent his morning measuring answers rather than gathering them. He said the temporary order was in effect and had been acknowledged by the bank and the necessary offices. He said Oliver's early comparisons made the so-called agreement look worse, not better, and that Renee had found scheduling gaps that lined up like missing teeth. He spoke without insult and without triumph. He said Jason might face civil consequences for what had been attempted, and that if a prosecutor saw fit to ask further questions, that would be for those offices to decide on their own time. Most importantly, he said there was a simple path for Lauren. She could file a voluntary renunciation of any claim she had tried to press beyond what the will allowed, and she could partner with the court to make sure the estate followed the decedent's clear wishes. He could have said more. He did not. He understood that a pause is a kindness when a person is deciding who she will be next. When the call ended, a second one arrived, brisk and professional, from a reporter named Claire Monroe. She had seen the neighborhood page tilt towards speculation and had since spoken with sources who asked her to look again with both eyes open. She said her editors were preparing a correction that would move the story toward the larger issue at its heart, the ways families sometimes pressure elders to surrender dignity in the name of convenience. She asked if Evelyn might speak on the record about the value of pauses and the difference between help and control. Evelyn avoided speeches as a rule, but she knew the value of a sentence that could offer someone else a handle. She agreed to a short conversation later that week at Pike Place on the condition that no one turned her family into a spectacle. Claire said she preferred light to heat and would keep it that way. The call ended with a gratitude that sounded like respect. The afternoon thinned. People came and went. The espresso machine hissed like a cat that only ever pretends to be angry. Evelyn pulled a neat manila envelope from her tote. Inside, Daniel had placed a form written in plain words, a voluntary statement by which Lauren could renounce any claim she had pursued beyond the will's terms, and a companion statement of cooperation that told the court she intended to help rather than hinder. Evelyn slid the papers across the table with no fanfare, only the weight of a fact placed directly where it belonged. Lauren reading the silence that did not feel like absence. The form spoke clearly and without legal flourish. It asked for a name and a date, for a signature that would say more about character than about ink. Her hand shook the way a hand shakes when it learns that honesty has its own temperature. She set the pen down and closed her eyes for a long breath that felt like taking off a coat. Then she opened them and signed. The barista set down a small plate of biscotti, as if the calf had decided to bless solemn things with something that snapped. Lauren looked across the table and said she would also write her apology for the church bulletin and for the family email, and that she would read it aloud at the next gathering if her mother wished. Evelyn said reading it aloud would help people hold the same story in their heads. She offered to look at the draft only to check comfort with truth, not to polish for optics. She said that how Lauren sounded would matter less than whether she stood straight inside the words. Outside, a woman walked past with a violin case and a child who asked if they could stop for cocoa. The barista smiled in their direction as if cocoa were one of the ways a city holds itself together. Claire's follow-up text chimed with details for the Pike Place interview. A quiet corner by the flower stalls, a time that avoided crowds, a promise to keep names to first names where possible. Daniel texted a simple, "Well done." He did not add exclamation points. He trusted the moment to stand on its own feet. Evelyn placed both hands over Lauren's for a breath and then took them away so the gesture would feel like blessing rather than grip. She reminded her daughter that service hours worked best when they were given to tasks that required listening, delivering groceries to shut-ins, reading forms aloud to people whose eyesight wore out before their patients did, sitting through long phone menus until a human voice answered for someone who had already spent a day asking a world not built for them to please slow down. They rose to leave and clear their cups to the bus bin, because dignity also lives in small chores. At the door, the bell chimed and the draft slid across the floor. Evelyn offered her daughter her scarf against the Seattle damp and then realized Lauren had come with her own, They smiled at the old habit and the new fact of it. On the sidewalk, the gray had softened to a silver that made the street look brushed. They walked a block together without talking. Then another. The link train sighed on its rail like a long, patient animal. The city's music returned. A bicycle bell, a dog collar, a distant siren that minded its own business. Back at the house in Ballard, the rooms greeted Evelyn with their plain welcome. She set the signed form on her desk and called Daniel, who promised to file it first thing on Monday morning. She phoned St. Mark's to ask about volunteer slots and a small announcement the following week for a new elder support fund. The woman who answered said the choir would be singing at a concert soon, and that if Evelyn brought her announcement, they would make space for it near the cocoa table. She cooked soup and butter toast, because good things should repeat when they do not ask much of a person's energy. She wrote a short list on a card: apology draft, service schedule, Pike Place, bank confirmation follow-up. She added a line that read simply, "Be kind where possible, firm where needed." Evening gathered. The neighborhood put on its quiet shoes. A fairy horn far off sounded like an old story clearing its throat. Evelyn watched her cup and watched the window go from a mirror to a picture. Her phone buzzed against the counter with the clipped urgency of a message that wanted to be read now and not later. The name on the screen made sense. Jason had never liked to wait when he believed the narrative might braid itself without him. She opened the message and let the words sit where they were, unedited and exactly as intended. The text from Jason appeared: "Tonight, let's talk. I have another way." Evelyn looked at Lauren. "You can listen, but we will not compromise with what is wrong." Morning came clear and cold, the Monday after Thanksgiving, and downtown wore steel and glass like a winter suit. At the entrance to King County Superior Court, people moved through security with the quiet purpose of a weekday that knows its own business. Evelyn and Lauren stepped inside with Daniel, coats unbuttoned, breath steady, eyes awake. The corridors held their familiar echo, and the light from high windows fell across floors that had watched 1,000 small reckonings. In a conference room not much larger than a choir practice space, Daniel arranged papers with the neat confidence of a person who trusts the process he serves. A clerk entered, then a judge, and the air shifted into that respectful stillness where sentences count. Daniel summarized the status in plain terms. The temporary order to preserve the estate remained in force. The bank had acknowledged it. There had been no unauthorized changes. He handed up the voluntary renunciation that Lauren had signed over the weekend and a short statement of cooperation. He did not present these as trophies, but as tools that build a cleaner path. The judge read, nodded, and asked two simple questions in the tone of someone who expects honesty. Did Evelyn understand the pause protecting her home? And did Lauren intend to honor the steps laid out by the court? Yes and yes. There was no drama. Only the relief that comes when a room of grown people agree to walk by the same light. The clerk recorded the notes, and the judge thanked everyone for not letting strain become spectacle. They left the building with that peculiar mix of tired and calm that trails a necessary morning. On the sidewalk, the city's ordinary music returned. A bicycle bell, a street bus signed to a stop, the murmur of phones offering directions to people who had already found their way. Daniel paused near the steps and said he would file 2 additional notices before the day turned, then meet them later, if needed, at Seattle Center. He reminded them to rest where they could. He reminded them that keeping a boundary is not the same as building a wall. His smile reached his eyes. He went back inside to finish the work. By afternoon, the plaza at Seattle Center brightened under strings of lights that seemed to exhale warmth as the sun leaned toward evening. The Winterfest booths added their cheerful order to the day. Skates laced at the rink, children balancing on blades like small, determined birds, a cocoa stand sending up a ribbon of chocolate steam that drifted like a hymn. Near the heart of it, a simple folding table wore a handwritten sign for an elder support fund, and Evelyn and Lauren stood behind it with a thermos of hot cider and a jar labeled with a promise rather than a demand. People came for directions and conversation as much as for cider. A man asked where to find the choir sing-along, a grandmother asked about rides to medical appointments for neighbors who did not drive anymore, a teenager asked if service hours counted if you also enjoyed them. Each question was a small door. Evelyn kept opening them. The first friends to arrive were two women from St. Mark's, who had guided casseroles to the right kitchens in the hard week after the funeral. They hugged Evelyn and greeted Lauren as if a seat had been saved for her all along. When they learned that Lauren would be volunteering, they offered sign-up sheets and told her what tasks require a calm voice. Calling insurance phone trees, until human answers, reading forms to people whose patience outlasted their eyesight, carrying heavy grocery sacks to front steps with their steep Seattle stairs. Lauren listened with both attention and relief. Making amends is not a speech, it is a habit. She wrote her name and times she knew she could keep. A neighbor from Ballard recognized Evelyn and slipped 2 bills into the jar with the quiet joy of helping where help lands right. A skater in a knitted hat bumped the glass wall and laughed at her own wobble. Someone's dog wore a scarf as red as a peppermint stripe. Late afternoon tilted into that luminous gray the city does so well. And in the midst of it, Claire Monroe arrived with a paper held under her arm, the way a messenger carries good news that took effort to shape. She smiled, not with the grin of a scoop, but with the modest satisfaction of a correction done right. She handed the printed edition to Evelyn and tapped a column that told the story without spectacle. It spoke of pauses that protect dignity, of the difference between assistance and control, of how communities can notice the line where help becomes pressure and choose to honor the person who lives on the other side. Names were kept simple. Details served the point and not the appetite. Claire thanked Evelyn for trusting a brief interview at Pike Place earlier in the day and nodded to Lauren, saying that a clear apology in the family is more powerful than any headline. She did not stay long. Reporters know when the right presence is absence. Before she left, she asked if she might quote one sentence Evelyn had offered. That kindness is not a substitute for fairness, but a companion to it. Evelyn said yes. Claire slipped away into the current of the crowd. More visitors stepped forward, each with a story that brushed the edge of their own lives. A man with quiet hands said his mother had once signed a paper she did not understand, and it took a year to untangle. He tipped his hat toward the jar and said he liked the idea of bridges and not traps. A counselor from a community center said she would be glad to partner on a workshop that translated financial forms into sentences a tired mind could hold. A teenager asked if anyone would mind if she stood at the table for an hour and redirected people with silly questions so Evelyn could sit. No one minded. The teenager made a small sign that pointed to the rink and another that pointed to the cocoa line. And she did it with the confidence of a person who has never yet doubted the value of signs. When the choir from St. Mark's began an informal program, its sound carried across the plaza like warm light poured into a cold glass. The notes were old and honest. People stopped without needing to be asked. Lauren cleared her throat and, in a voice that belonged to a grown woman, making a promise she meant to keep, apologized to the small group of neighbors gathered near the table. She named what she had done without decoration. She did not ask for forgiveness as a transaction. She said she would serve because service can change a person from the hands outward. Evelyn stood beside her without stepping into the space that did not belong to her. A few people put hands on their hearts the way Americans do when they do not know what else to do with gratitude. The choir moved from one carol to another, stitching the crowd loosely together. Daniel appeared in time for the last song, his scarf carrying a little weather from downtown. He reported quietly that the court's notes were complete for the day, that the bank had confirmed internally what Thomas had told them already, and that a few follow-ups would wait for ordinary mornings that did not ask people to choose between paperwork and peace. He pressed no one for plans. He reminded Lauren to send him her signed apology so he could add it to the file as an acknowledgement of cooperation. And he did it without smuggling shame into the request. He accepted a paper cup of cider and said it was the right heat for the hour. Evening put on its true coat, and the lights around the plaza sharpened into their generous glow. Volunteers lit a few more lanterns along the path to the table, and the small jar was now a little heavier, which felt less like money than like a vote for the right kind of world. Evelyn stood for a long moment and watched people help one another find the edge of the rink or the nearest trash can. The simple economy of motion that makes a public space feel like a living room. She thought of the courthouse that morning and how kindness and structure had stood side by side like two pillars, holding a roof over a family in weather. She felt not triumph but steadiness, the kind that frees air in the room. Claire returned briefly with a single copy of the print page, now warm from someone's hands at the press. She offered it to Evelyn as a keepsake. The layout gave the story space without shouting. In a small sidebar, resources were listed for seniors and their families. Clinics, hotlines, legal aid desks at the courthouse, church programs that offered rides and reading eyes. Claire thanked Evelyn again and left them with a good night that sounded like a benediction. They packed the table slowly, because lingering was part of the gift. Volunteers folded a sign and tucked it under a crate of paper cups. The rink lights dimmed a measure, then brightened for another round. Somewhere nearby, a brass quartet tested the first bars of a carol and then got it right. A neighbor from Ballard offered a ride home, and Evelyn thanked her and said they would walk a bit first to catch the cold on their cheeks. The crowd shifted as news moved through the plaza in a soft way. Holiday news travels. A boat would pass soon. A boat with lights and songs. A flotilla that turns water into a mirror. People began to drift toward Lake Union, where the shoreline makes its own amphitheater. Evelyn and Lauren joined the gentle migration, Daniel a few steps behind, then turning back after a short wave so mother and daughter could have a stretch of evening to themselves. They stood at the edge where the city loosens its tie and lets the water do some of the talking. The air held the scent of cedar and cinnamon and the little engine smell that comes with every gathering that floats. Across the dark surface, a cluster of lights gathered and moved as one. Voices lifted, thin at first and then sure. The old words rose from the water as if the lake itself had learned them by heart. They carried less doctrine than comfort, less certainty than companionship, which is what people mostly want from songs when the year leans toward its quietest days. Evelyn felt Lauren's shoulder brush hers. They had traveled a short distance and a great one. The Christmas ship out on Lake Union is about to glide past. The carols rise. Evelyn gently squeezes her daughter's hand. Let's go home. The lights reflect on the lake, opening a new season. Winter lights trembled on the water, and somewhere behind them, a choir folded old melodies into the cold evening. After a morning of plain words at the courthouse and an afternoon of cocoa and small, decent gestures, a mother and her grown daughter simply stood together and let quiet do its work. What had been loud pressure, rumor, pride softened into the steadiness of boundaries kept and promises made, the kind of peace that arrives when truth is spoken without hurry and dignity is protected without spectacle. The lesson is not complicated. Love needs firmness to stay honest, apology needs follow-through to become repair, and the house becomes a home again when compassion and fairness share the same table. For many listening, this is ordinary life reading. Before signing, checking on a neighbor, choosing help that does not control, yet those small choices are how families outlast hard seasons. If this story touched a tender place, consider passing a little warmth forward. Like a porch light left on at dusk, a simple kindness can guide us around the darkest bend in the road.